Good morning, good afternoon. I'm not sure which you might consider this time to be, but welcome. We appreciate you attending this. This is the last of our initial series of webinars, and I'll introduce it in this sort of way. As a committee, as we were sitting around and thinking about some of the issues and items to discuss, one of the regional directors at the time, regional and a national level, said at the national level as they began to discuss things, policy was talked about quite a bit. So we're excited about this opportunity to talk about resiliency and policy and advocacy as regards AIA. You see the speakers here. Let me tell you a little bit about them. Blake Nanny is at the national level. He's a federal relations, I'm reading some notes here, federal relations manager at the American Institute of Architects in Washington, D.C. He works closely with his immediate teammates, along with AIA staff and AIA members and coalitions and public officials on federal policies impacting architects in our profession. And his policy portfolio includes resilience, affordable, and federal procurement. And he also is serving as a supporting role on many other issues and initiatives at that level. So Blake, welcome very much to the webinar. In addition to Blake, we have Ignacio Reyes, FAIA. We all know him in AIA Florida as one of our past presidents and vice presidents. And right now he serves as vice president, chief development officer at Leo A. Daly, and is instrumental in the firm's growth plans and strategies and marketing. But on a more personal level to each one of us, Ignacio has served as a president in AIA Florida and has been instrumental in some of the strategic items and elements of our discussions regarding policy and legislation and how all of those things affect our profession. And we appreciate him being here today as well. And part of Ignacio's one of the arrows in his quiver has been George Levesque with Gray Robinson here in Tallahassee. And George is the boots on the ground very much on a daily basis, it seems, with our state legislature and all the issues going on there. He's a shareholder in Gray Robinson's Tallahassee office, and he focuses his practice on civil litigation, appellate, and government matters. And he began working in private practice, so he started out as one of us, and he now focuses primarily on civil litigation defense. He served as a special counsel and policy advisor to the Florida Speaker of the House, and you can see he has qualifications plus. He's also served as general counsel for the Florida House of Representatives, and most recently as general counsel to the Florida Senate. So George, welcome as well. Crystal, you want to flip the slide and let's talk about what some of our goals are here. I'm not going to read this word for word, our course description. You guys hopefully have already seen this, but our objectives are to discuss resilience issues of policy and advocacy at the national and state levels and those perspectives, and perhaps get an idea of what we can do locally. We want to understand opportunities for additional actions and policies to be considered and how we might affect those, and explore how we can participate in all of those conversations and dialogues representing our concerns and our expertise, and really be at the table. And then examine how advocacy can encourage critical dialogue between ourselves as a profession and our community leaders and policymakers in our communities and regions around the state. I want to, Crystal, you want to flip this? This is part of our resiliency committee efforts. And you see photos of the resiliency committee right here. You can find this all online at AIA Florida. And this is one of 6, this is coming out of one of 6 white papers that have been prepared that you can find online as well. If you go to AIA Florida, you can drill down and find these, and we hope these to be live and active and being updated as time goes on. So come back and check these frequently if you can. And certainly if you would like to be part of the resiliency committee and these efforts, we would welcome you to the table. You see a list here of many of our participants, and it's a it's a pretty good list. I thank everyone here for being part of this. There's a lot to consider and a lot to chew on as we consider resiliency in the state of Florida, and I really appreciate this. So with that, let me start with Crystal. I think that's the last of my slides. Let me start with Blake. I'm going to turn it over to you, and if you could begin to share with us your experience and what you're doing and how we can help. Welcome.
Sure. Thank you so much, Monty, and good afternoon, everyone. Bear with me just as a moment as I get this going on my end. Monty, can you see this on your end?
Yes, it looks great. Thank you.
Great. Thank you so much. Well, good afternoon. Again, AIA Florida, thank you so much for having me here to join you today to talk a little bit about what we're doing at the federal level on our resilience policies and advocating, whether that be to Congress or the presidency or elsewhere, and how folks can weigh in. Before I get going with my presentation, did want to just note that had the personal honor to meet with some of the great Florida advocates during this year's Leadership Summit and Lobby Day. I believe some of those folks brought some of those white paper resilience resources you were just mentioning there, Monty. So great work to your team in Florida. And we can go ahead and get going and start talking a little bit high level here on what I'm going to go through my segment up for about the next 15 minutes. Thought it was noteworthy to start with the current lay of the land and some of the big items we see that's going to take up a lot of oxygen out of the room at the congressional level for the next few weeks. After that, I will shift into some of our notable federal policies and programs, things we're currently engaged on, keeping an eye on, or have already made a position statement in regards to. And we'll focus sort of two pieces on legislative and then moving into some of the regulatory and legislative implementation work that we're engaged on. Finally, I'll speak a little bit more about how folks down in Florida can plug into what we're doing at the national level. And of course, I'll be here for Q&A at the end. But with that, starting with sort of the lay of the land of this 118th Congress here in 2023, we're already in Q2 now, and there's been a lot of things that's happened on the Hill, not a ton legislatively, but a lot of action that has taken up a lot of headlines. One thing we'd like to note that's sort of happening at the beginning of this year that folks, anyone tracking the news, I'm sure well aware of already, was the contentious speakership election for Speaker of the House. And as we know, Speaker Kevin McCarthy ultimately did win that sort of House election on the House floor, though it took about a week for that to happen. That was a little bit unprecedented in the modern era. It's been about 100 years since something like that's quite happened. And why I want to elevate that particular issue and point in time is because those actions and that sort of delay has had ripple effects through the workload and the timeline that Congress is working on. And you'll see that as we talk through some of the legislation we see that impacted on just about all of our portfolio items. A lot of bills that we've endorsed last Congress have not been reintroduced yet. That's pretty commonplace across issues outside of resilience. We'll talk about some issues that's already been reintroduced, but there's a lot of pieces that still need to get reintroduced and have a new bill number. So that speaker election did have impacts, and we are still feeling that today. The speaker is also required is the person that swears in new members, very instrumental in selecting committee assignments and what those new websites for those committees look like. And we can see on our end that a lot of that sort of delayed, and folks are sort of getting up to speed now, but that has taken some time. Another issue I wanted to elevate that probably everybody has heard on every news station, regardless of what you watch or read, is this debt ceiling debate. And I'm happy to take questions at the end and kind of explain a little bit more of what this isn't and what it's not, but sort of in a nutshell, we are nearing sort of a crisis mode between the Congress and the presidency to statutorily raise our debt limit, which is a sort of a barrier we put in place via Congress all the way back in 1917 that essentially limits the amount of payments we can pay on our bills. If an agreement does not get reached by as soon as June 1st, as Treasury Secretary Yellen was estimated last week that we could, as a federal government, run out of money to pay our bills. That's less than a month away. And this is a very timely item because the president and the four corners of congressional leadership in the House and the Senate are actually having a meeting at the White House on this today. Stay tuned in the news for this afternoon. We expect that to be very well covered. Folks like us are not going to be in that room, but that's one of those issues that could impact every taxpayer directly and immediately. It's also worthy to note, even if a deal does ultimately get reached, depending how close to that deadline that happens, that could have drastic impacts as well. The closest time we were sort of at a crisis point with the debt ceiling recently was in 2011. And at the time, President Obama and Speaker Boehner did reach an agreement, but they got so close to the wire that it rattled markets. And for the first time in history, the U.S. credit rating was degraded, which impacted every taxpayer. So just kind of to highlight some of the big things that folks on the Hill and in the president's office will be working on and going to take up a lot of the attention until that's resolved. All that said, want to shift now into sort of some of the notables within this environment, this Congress, that we've been actively engaged on. One bill I wanted to elevate at the top is the Disaster Survivors Fairness Act. As I mentioned, not a lot of legislation has been reintroduced. This is the one bill firmly within our resilience and equity portfolio that has, and a really positive bill, bipartisan, only in the House, not a Senate bill introduction just yet, but this would really streamline FEMA's post-disaster assistance to disaster-stricken communities and better targets those communities that are in real need. So happy to talk more specifics on this bill, but we're happy to see that get introduced in the House, and we'll continue working on this one for a Senate introduction and to get this across the finish line. Another bill I wanted to elevate is the Resilience America Act. This is one of the legislative items that anyone from Florida who engaged and flew out to DC for this year's Lobby Day and Leadership Summit, y'all are probably familiar with this one. This is one of the two bills our advocates spoke directly on to Capitol Hill policymakers back in around mid-February this year. And as the name implies, it's a very resilient focused bill, resilience and equity focused, makes a lot of key changes to FEMA's pre-disaster mitigation programs, primarily the BRIC program. And I'll mention that again later in my presentation. And BRIC stands for the Building Resilient Infrastructure and Communities Program. And it's one of FEMA's flagship sort of programs to help communities prepare before disasters, not just recovering post-disaster. So this bill would sort of amp up the funding to that program and provide specific set-asides for a new resilience homes retrofit program, as well as specific set-asides for building code adoption and enforcement, which we know is very important when thinking about code. So this is one of those bills that hasn't been reintroduced yet. There are some ongoing conversations between the relevant committees of jurisdiction in the House and Senate, but one that we're absolutely going to continue working on to get passed ultimately into law. Another thing that we worked on earlier this year is our FY 2024 Homeland Security request. And why Homeland Security is relevant here is because that is the wider federal department and the relevant subcommittee in the House and Senate that funds FEMA and the programs that they manage. So we included a call for some significant funding for that BRIC program, as well as FEMA capitalization grants, relatively newly codified as a way to set up state-based revolving loan funds with a sort of a direct infusion from the feds via FEMA. So we called for about $100 million for that for the next year. And AIA also engaged with our coalition called the Building Resilient Action Coalition, or BRAC, very similar to BRIC, but not the same thing. But this is about a 28-member organization coalition that we lead, and we host monthly meetings on the first Wednesday of every month. This is one of those items that we coordinated directly with them on. So we submitted both AIA's own letter and a coalition letter that was essentially identical in our federal ask to appropriators earlier this year. And all that can be found on our federal website if you'd like to learn more. One other bill I wanted to flag before moving to some of our regulatory policy is the Community Disaster Resilience Zones Act, or CDRS, as I'll call it. And you'll notice here there's not a bill number next to it, but a public law number, because this was a big win on our resilience portfolio last year. Late last year, Congress passed this bill. It was signed into law and essentially creates or allows the president the ability to create CDRS designated communities. And if designated as such, those folks would be eligible for additional federal cost sharing, financial support, technical support, and it also requires FEMA to regularly update some materials and resources they have that project climate risk around the country. Most importantly, that touch point is the National Risk Index, which is the NRI. One of those resources we understand the insurance industry is already utilizing to kind of develop their geographical insurance policies and rates depending on the level of risk and community resources, the health of the infrastructure, things like that in those localities. So this bill took a very innovative approach by taking some of the best practices from the insurance industry and sort of leveraging that directly within FEMA policy. So really happy to see that bill get across the finish line. And that will be an opportunity later this year to formally comment on how that program should take shape and look like at the FEMA level. Moving on into some other notables, focusing on our regulatory side of our engagement, primarily with federal agencies. One thing I wanted to elevate up at the top here is a HUD CDBG-DR letter. That is a mouthful. The acronym stands for the Community Development Block Grant Disaster Recovery Program, which HUD administers. This is a fairly flexible federal funding program that HUD administers that helps folks in disaster-stricken areas, particularly within public housing agencies, to rebuild after disaster. And this is typically funded by a disaster supplemental package after a major disaster like a Hurricane Harvey level event. We submitted formal comments when HUD was seeking input on this. We worked with our housing KC as well as the Disaster Assistance Committee, and our copy can be found directly online. I just took a snapshot to put this on the page to give a sense of kind of the start of this, but we were really happy to have the opportunity to weigh in on that. Beyond that, the next two bullet points are actually current opportunities. And this could be an opportunity for folks on the line to weigh in if they're interested. HUD is currently seeking feedback on establishing a new federal flood risk management standard, or FFRMS. There is a public comment period open until May 23rd on this, and we are still seeking feedback from our Housing Knowledge Community, Disaster Assistance Committee, and the RAD-AG to help inform what our letter will be. We're going to close that about midweek next week. So if this is something that sounds like you'd like to engage on, feel free to reach out to me at blakenanny@ai.org, and I'll get you connected with the information you need, and we'd love to hear from you. Beyond that, did just want to flag as an opportunity the FEMA National Advisory Council. From our understanding, this is about a 40-member council, and there's currently going to be 9 open positions that FEMA is filling for this, and particularly looking for professionals with experience around emergency management, emergency response providers, and folks who work in standard settings and accrediting related professionals. So if this may be relevant for you, you can simply find, if you Google that bullet point there, the comment period should come up. But if you'd like to reach out to me, I'd be happy to send you the relevant links in case you would want to apply for that. In case I didn't mention, the deadline to apply is May 21st, later this month. I won't spend too much time on CEDAR's implementation, as we already mentioned that, but IIJA and IRA implementation is one thing that I'd be remiss not to add on my part of the presentation with you all today. Obviously, AIA at the federal level and our federal policy team worked very hard at the beginning of the new administration and the Congress before this one to really make the case that buildings are infrastructure, and that as Congress is thinking about substantial infrastructure investment, buildings must be a part of that. We're happy to report that we largely we won on that. There was significant funding for the first time and really a federal infrastructure bill sort of perspective directly into the building sector. So that's a precedent advocates can build upon into the future, but also a massive opportunity for architects and practitioners at the state and local level. So our state and local team's been doing a great job kind of rolling out those opportunities out to the full membership and states that they may be relevant for, but certainly a big opportunity that's going to continue to ramp up over time as federal agencies start to utilize that new funding and put it into action. If anyone would like to learn more about IIJA and IRA, we do have more information on our federal policy issues page. So this is my last slide. I know I'm running up on time, so I'll move through this one fairly quickly, but wanted just to spend a few moments on some ways for folks to get engaged with what we're doing here at the federal level. First and foremost, one thing that is very relevant and does make a difference when we're talking to policymakers is our action alerts. And we typically send these out via email, so these will be in your inbox, and that's the best way to stay tuned for those. And we typically ask for folks to take an action, to send a message to the member of Congress on a given policy with sort of a pre-built message that we like to allow folks to still keep editable. And those strengthen numbers when we approach the membership on things like that. Can be really impactful when we know we go into a federal policymaking office, a member of Congress where a number of folks, constituents we know already reached out to them about this issue. It can change the tone of a conversation. Congressional staff have to report all those emails coming in, and it does make a difference. So if you see those alerts come in, it is a process to get those out to the full members. So it's typically an important point in time when we do that, make that request. So please take action. And always, if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to our team and we're happy to talk more. Additionally, volunteering roles. One of the things that we often do working through our government advocacy committee is work through liaisons that sort of work directly with some membership groups. We have Gail Nippel, who works with our disaster assistance committees at AIA, the DAC, and the RADAG. It's a great way to kind of get involved, hear what we're doing, and weigh directly in, whether it be a new bill, a new policy, a new regulatory implementation approach. We often lean on those groups to help inform our position. So please feel free to get involved there. Stay up to date on things on AIA.org. And I would recommend folks to go to the federal policy issues page. So if you go to AIA.org, navigate to advocacy on that sub bar at the top, and then go to the federal policy issues page. We just made a very comprehensive update that has all of our content currently up to date. So if you'd like to take a look at what recent policy letters we recently sent, or even some policy letters and position statements that we did maybe 3 or 4 years ago, that can be found there. Also, do want to elevate the Specs on the Union quarterly updates that our team is now leading. My teammates and I, once a quarter, so 4 times a year, do a course through the AIAU web portal to give about a 1-hour update on the big things happening on Capitol Hill and how that may be relevant to architects. It's for free for AIA members, and you do get 1 learning unit credit for that. So please keep an eye out for that. We talked about regulatory comments, but if there's ever an area that AIA is not engaged on, that could be an opportunity for you personally to advocate on a given issue. There's just about an organization out there for every interest group. Feel free to take a look at those if that's something that you're interested in. Then last but not least, before I give my time back, I believe today, hot off the presses, AIA National is going to be releasing a new resilience design toolkit. That is one of those resources I understand can be used directly within folks' practices. So please keep an eye out for an update there. With that, Monty, I think I'm going to stop sharing my screen and I'll give the time or the floor back to you, sir. Thank you.
Blake, thank you very much. I've made some notes, so if nobody else has any questions at the end, I probably will. In the meantime, without further delay, Ignacio, can you jump in here and share with us what you can bring to the table today?
Absolutely, absolutely. So I'm going to talk a little bit about our advocacy efforts here at AIA Florida and how we've been effective and how hard it is to get things accomplished, but how important it is to have everyone involved. So again, I'm Ignacio Reyes, FAIA, former president of AIA Florida. But for years, I was a vice president and in charge of advocacy. And that's what got me really hooked on moving issues forward. And one of the things I always talk about with AIA members, Florida members, is, how can our voices be heard? Where can we focus our energy and how can we be successful? And too many people don't understand what advocacy is really about. They don't understand how important it is to have everyone engaged in the process. It's critically important to have architects from across the spectrum visible and engaged in conversations. And when you go to these conversations, we talk about specifically legislative day and how have had some successes. It's come through an understanding of your audience, an understanding of what we are trying to advocate for, and understanding what we're not trying to advocate for. It's a big issue to when you work with all the architects as we go forward and meeting with legislators, that we are there for a purpose, and it's for the profession. It's for the practice of architecture, and it's for the AIA Florida Association, which is the only profession in existence that is there to protect your license and your ability to practice. So we're there for certain specific issues focused on our practice and our communities. Resiliency is one of those core factors. Resiliency is one of the things that drives us in every aspect of our practice, in every aspect of what we do. So we started the conversation on resiliency not quite some time ago. We had a strategic council, and if you don't know how our board is formed, we have a strategic council that creates big ideas that helps inform our strategy for the AI Florida board. That strategic council back in 2016 talked about the importance of understanding sea level rise and how we can look at sustainability and resiliency in terms of our communities here in Florida. From that got forwarded to that strategic council got forwarded to the board took action, and the vice president at the time, which was myself in charge of advocacy, we helped craft a conversation about resiliency and flooding in Florida. We presented all these conversations to all the architects, prepared them for how to go forward to have a conversation. We had in the old Capitol building, where we trained everyone on the conversation, what to say, what not to say. And the big issue about that conversation, though, is we were coming into this conversation at a time where the politics of the day did not allow you to even say the words climate change or sea level rise. You couldn't even say those two terms. So how do you go in there and advocate for something that's so critical for the state of Florida and yet is not even permitted to be spoken about in public at the legislature? So it was a really awkward moment. And at some point, we were a little worried about how our teammates were going to be accepted in the conversation. Well, we crafted a poster, which we do every year, and we go to the legislature with a poster, and we present this poster that talks about the core issues of the moment. This one was designed by Jeff Huber and some of his associates, Jeff Huber, FAIA, and a whole team of individuals to help craft a storyline about how flooding impacts everyone and how there's 5 forms of flooding. So this poster came into the conversation about being resilient, recognizing that flooding happens. Why it happens is always the social issue that becomes a hot button issue. Put that on the shelf and you deal strictly with, we're flooding. Where it comes from, who cares? But we're flooding, and flooding is a concern, and we have to do something about it. And this conversation was huge because it talked about this damage to tourism, damage to washed out beaches, agriculture getting impacted by saltwater intrusion to aquifers, drinking water being hit, algae blooms. There were so many aspects of how sea level rise and our state's reaction to it were intertwined. We have to be focused and engaged. We came to the legislature with this conversation. We didn't go in there with a aggressive or opinionated process. We went with very factual issues associated with the day, and we got everyone's attention. So much so that I remember being in the room with, at the time, the Senate president, and speaking about possibly getting funding from OPAGA, from the other state agencies, to see how we could study the impacts, the economic impacts of sea level rise. But this graphic representation that you see on the screen, it caught everyone's attention with the idea that those areas in red are likely to be flooded in a certain period of time in the future. And that's not that far away. It caught everyone's attention. It had scientific backing, and we did not go into issues of why or how or other issues. We just said, this is real, this is happening. It's hitting farmlands, it's hitting coastal areas, inland areas, and it's a critical concern for us to address. We were successful in getting conversations started. We were successful in getting a movement started, if you will, with legislators. What that worked on, if you understand how the sausage is made, so to speak, and they say in the legislative process, is you've got to start somewhere and get people to recognize there's an issue. So the results weren't extraordinary. We didn't have any legislation enacted that session. We didn't have a bill we can shout and say, hey, let's support this bill because it does X, Y, or Z for sea level rise or climate change or resiliency. What we did do is we changed minds on both sides of the aisle to recognize the importance of this issue and to recognize that we have to be on the forefront of engagement of ideas. And architects, I will say this obviously selfishly as an architect, we're problem solvers. Our key talent in education is solving problems. We come to the conversation from a problem solving perspective. So the next year, I was still the vice president of advocacy. I did 2 years in a row for some great reason. I loved it, but I did 2 years in a row as advocacy chair. We did another conversation, and this was all about the role of climate impacts on architecture. It dominated our conversations again. Here we had a new governor and a new conversation, and we were allowed to say the word sea level rise and climate change and those kinds of conversations. Those are now permitted, but we didn't go on a high horse. We didn't go crazy on it. We just talked very openly and conversationally about the fact that this is still a major concern. And there are significant areas in the state that are going to get impacted by flooding. We showed the district overlays of both the Senate and House districts, and they could see quickly where their areas are going to be impacted by flooding, where our codes need to be respectful of resilience, of designing for resilience, and how architects have a voice in the storm aftermath, and how we can be advocates for helping recovery efforts from a resiliency perspective, resiliency planning perspective. This again got people's attention. It was not in a adversarial way. We went to both sides of the aisle. We spoke in a language that talked about economic damage, it talked about agricultural damage, tourism hits. We got everyone's attention to say we have to do something. This year was the year that we actually ended up having activity. So in 2019, we were able to have bills filed. And that's the step. When I talk about the process, there is no quick fix, there is no quick shot, and you're there and you won the day, it's all over. It just doesn't work that way. With our legislature, we have to be present and active. So we had to go in and we went in the conversations, and here we had several bills that were filed that dealt with resiliency, that dealt with the core issues at hand that we were trying to advocate. Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez created the Florida Disaster Resilience Task Force. It unfortunately didn't make it through the legislative process. Representative Ben Diamond established the Florida Climate Resiliency Research Program that also died. And in Florida, the way that works is you have bills that go into the House or bills that go in the Senate. They have to go through the various committees. They have to reconcile, and they have to be passed as a whole, and then go to the governor's office, governor's desk for signature. And there's a time frame. If you don't meet that time frame, the bill just dies. And a lot of times they'll die in committee, or they'll make it through one chamber, but they won't make it to the other chamber, and so on and so forth. So you have to be proactive and get engaged early, pushing for these conversations, getting people to understand it, and getting people to be open-minded about what possibly can be done. And what we've been trying to do with all these legislators is not only advocate for resiliency, but advocate to be part of the conversation. So when Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez is forming a bill, or when Representative Diamond was, or any other legislator, we want to be part of that conversation. We want to offer our services as architects, as problem solvers, to say, how can we help you craft legislation that helps the state of Florida, and in turn helps our environment and helps our business, helps our practice. So we go to that conversation and advocacy, not just advocating for something, we offer something in return of how can we help? How can we be your problem solver? How can we help bounce ideas off of others and make things happen? So the following year in 2020, we did another conversation that was again about resiliency. In this scenario, we were dealing with a lot of different issues that year, whether it was deregulation of our practice, which was an honest, real bill that was filed to deregulate architecture, kind of crazy. That's why you always got to be engaged. But this dealt with the aftermath of the hurricane in the Panhandle that showed how proper building design can create resiliency in the face of massive issues of storms and storm surges and hurricanes, things of that nature. So this image was on our poster, and it showed the one building that survived Michael when the rest of the projects were all wiped out from the hurricane, the storms, and the storm surges. So then again, this is graphic representation, captures the hearts and minds of both sides of the aisle to recognize things have to get done. There are real issues here. Real issues cause real concerns, and we have to work together. So again, I go back to the process. We started in 2018, 2019, 2020, 2018, you initiate the conversations, you get people open minds, and you have a way of approaching all sides of the issue, so to speak, to understand there's an issue. 2019, we actually got some bills filed and some movements in committees and some conversations. In 2020, we come in the conversation and we actually have some big successes. We actually had our first big success in resiliency. And that was when the legislature passed Senate Bill 178 by Senator Jose Javier Rodriguez from Miami, and House Bill 579 from Representative Vance Lupus from Miami. which requires a sea level impact projection prior to moving forward with public infrastructure projects in coastal areas. Now you may say, okay, that's just the coastal area, it doesn't address the big picture. 100% correct. But it is a victory. These are the moments you've got to move forward. You got to demonstrate that you got to get engaged in the conversation. You got to demonstrate the need, demonstrate how it impacts everyone evenly, and then get them to understand that this is something that they have the power to influence and protect the state of Florida for. So we got this conversation going. And as this bill passed, this is good evidence where Senator Rodriguez specifically called out the special thanks to the Florida chapter of the American Institute of Architects for all of our championing of this process. We went from legislature to legislator to legislator to champion Senate Bill 178, to argue for it, to support it. After 3 years of this advocacy, we finally got something passed that dealt with an actual sea level rise study on all public infrastructure before it gets built. As an architect practicing here in Florida, I know we just did that with the city of Miami Beach on a project where we had to look at what the sea level rise impacts were going to be for a city infrastructure project. So these are good moments that move us forward in the conversation. Our 2021 legislative day, we kept going back and back and back for the same conversations. We talked about transformation and how the state is transforming and how we are transforming the practices, but we had to constantly talk about resiliency. And resiliency was a big factor in that conversation of transformation. And we talked about specific bills from Chip LaMarca or from Senator Rodriguez again, another Senator Rodriguez, and all about trying to create an office of a chief resiliency officer, or a statewide office of resiliency and the statewide sea level rise task force. We want to create a think tank for sea level rise. We work hard to advocate for that, keeping the momentum moving forward. You know, we don't always succeed, but we've got hearts and minds thinking in certain ways. So we had the climate health planning bill that didn't succeed. We had a climate fiscal responsibility bill that didn't succeed. We looked at the climate resiliency research program. Those had movements, various efforts. At the end of the day, we looked at statewide office of resiliency. It didn't make it that term, but it had gone through several iterations. Fast forward 2022, the legislative day again, we're engaged in the conversations. We're back to talking to folks, back to meeting them in person after the pandemic. And we again resiliency is on every single one of these conversations from 2018 to 2022, always arguing about legislation, dealing with resiliency and how it's important to the state and to the practice of architecture. Well, we were finally successful. We were able to pull off House Bill 7053, companion to Senate Bill 1940 that was on our poster that created an office for the chief resiliency officer at the state level. That was a big victory. And AI Florida had a lot to do with advocating for it for all members of both parties. And we were able to meet with the office and put ourselves out there as problem solvers, as partners, as a way of helping them accomplish their goals. Everybody wants to see something happen, but everyone gets stuck on the issues, how to get there. That's why I think architecture is a uniquely positioned problem-solving group to be part of those conversations, because we see things in different lights from a design perspective and how they impact our communities. So I'll close out our conversation, just say that the work doesn't stop there. You know, AIA Florida is always looking for volunteers to be engaged. And it's not just going to Tallahassee once a year from a January perspective and going to legislative day, but it's being engaged locally on your communities. Every component has engagement with local representatives, where we hand out our associate groups FAPAC checks, which is helping make donations to certain elections and certain advocating or supporting certain politicians on both sides of the aisle. We look at that on a regular basis. We engage all the time. I can tell you that when you engage locally, your voice is multiplied when you're in Tallahassee. So it's a partnership process of being engaged locally and making things happen. So I would tell you that you have to be engaged as architects in Florida. You have to be part of this conversation. There's the old phrase, and I'm sure George will probably say the same thing, is if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. And for years we have been on the menu. So we have been very vocal about being active and being present and helping to craft the agenda that's going to shape our state and shape our practice. So I welcome everyone to understand that and welcome them to getting involved, to volunteering, to being part of the conversation, and putting your efforts into helping solve these critical issues. And with that, I'm going to turn it over back to Monty and to George.
Ignacio, thank you very much. All great points. The thought came to me as you were talking about this, as you were wrapping up. The moment that you began to say they instead of we, that tells you right there that you're not involved and you're not part of the conversation. And the more we can make it we, as in us and the legislature, impacted and made change, the better it can be. So that's my inspirational moment of the day. George, I'm gonna be quiet and let you take it over from here. Why don't you share your screen and let us know what's up?
Okay. Thank you, Monty. It's been my honor to represent AIA before all three branches of Florida's government. And when it comes to resiliency, the state has always struggled with extreme weather and the need for resiliency in its structures and its infrastructure. These challenges have most frequently been noted by or highlighted by hurricanes or other tropical weather that occurs all year round here in Florida. And those events can often serve as the impetus for policy changes, but as Ignacio was referencing, a lot of times what you will see is there will just be incremental changes that are made. If you think back to the early 90s when Hurricane Andrew came through, it took that storm to create an impetus to change Florida's building code and update that. The conflux of hurricanes and tropical storms in 2004 and 2005 also resulted in some changes to the Florida building code, but also brought an emphasis on mitigation and home hardening for residences and needed reforms in the property market. But even with those changes, there was still a long way to go. As Ignacio referenced, less than 10 years ago, there was a knee-jerk reaction and denial that there was a problem that needed to be addressed, despite the fact that there were frequent flooding in areas where flooding was not historically a problem. If you fast forward just a few years from 10 years ago to where we are now we have an Office of Resilience and Coastal Protection that was established within the Florida Department of Environmental Protection. You can say words like climate change and sea level rise, and you're not going to be automatically shut out. And on top of that, the state has created dedicated funding sources from dock stamp taxes to fund local government efforts and state efforts at resiliency. For example, for the coming fiscal year in 2023, the state has dedicated $200 million to fund the first 3 years of the statewide flooding and sea level rise resilience plan. But even now, we have a long way to go. Florida has 1,350 miles of coastline and relatively low elevations across the state. As sea level and groundwater levels rise and extreme rainfall events occur, Florida's storm runoff infrastructure can become strained and even overwhelmed. Recently, this was demonstrated in Broward with their historic rainfall, but Miami-Dade experiences it regularly with some of their king tides. Then you layer on top of that Florida is a growing state. We passed New York in the last decade to become the third largest state by population. And we're a state that's still growing. But thankfully, the current leadership in the state are taking steps, even if it's only incremental, to address some of these pressing issues. And they're doing this through a combination of both grants to local governments, grants to individuals, and regulations. So we're going to take a look at some of the legislation that passed this last session. House Bill 111 was one of those. As Ignacio referenced, one of the core bills that it was building on was Senate Bill 178 that was passed in 2020. Senate Bill 178 was landmark legislation that directed the Department of Environmental Protection to develop a standard by which local governments must conduct a sea level impact projection study or a SLIP study to evaluate construction before commencing it in certain coastal areas. What House Bill 111 did was expanded the requirement for those public entities to conduct those SLIP studies in any area that was at risk due to sea level rise, not just within areas designated as a coastal building zone. And it applied that to any critical asset or any historical or cultural assets. For those who may not know, critical assets are defined as transportation assets and that include evacuation routes, airports, bus terminals, ports, major roadways and marinas, and other rail and railroad bridges. It also includes critical infrastructure, including wastewater and stormwater treatment facilities, lift and pump stations, drinking water facilities, electric production and supply facilities, solid and hazard waste facilities, military installations, communications facilities, and waste management sites. It also includes critical community and emergency facilities, including schools, colleges, universities, community centers, correctional facilities, emergency medical service facilities, hospitals, as well as law enforcement facilities, among others. Historical and cultural assets, both under the existing law and under the current bill that just passed, House Bill 11, are not defined terms. Those are generally matters up to debate. There were a couple of pieces of legislation that were filed that made attempts to define those, but those never quite made it across the finish line. One of the notable things that House Bill 111 also did was it expanded the application of the Resilient Florida program. And this was another one of those programs that was established in 2021. And that program enhances the efforts to protect Florida's inland waterways, coastlines, and shores, which serve as invaluable natural defenses against sea level rise. When it was first established, the grant program provided funding opportunities for local governments. Under that, a county or municipality may apply and receive grants to fund costs for community resilience planning and necessary data collection for their SLIP studies. It can also use it for vulnerability assessments that identify or address risks of inland or coastal flooding and sea level rise, among other things. What House Bill 111 did was it expanded the grant program to provide funding to local governments for feasibility studies and permitting costs for nature-based solutions that reduce the impact of flooding and sea level rise. It also provided funding for water management districts to support the local government adaptation planning. These grants must be used for the express purposes of supporting either the flood hub or DEP through data creation and collection, modeling and implementation of statewide standards. Because as we move forward to try to make these changes and best create that resilient Florida that everybody wants, we need data. We need hard science on these things. And it's the data that the policymakers that are guiding these decisions, they want to see that data. And the better data we have, the better policies they can draft. The next piece of legislation that passed and will be going to the governor for signature is House Bill 881. And this makes changes to the My Safe Florida Home program. This was another one of those policies that grew out of the 2004 and 2005 hurricanes with an emphasis on home hardening and mitigation. And what the purpose of that program was, at least from the mitigation side, was it helped fund mitigation inspections to determine what mitigation measures were needed for residential properties, what insurance premium discounts might be available based upon a homeowner's mitigation efforts, and what improvements to existing residential properties might be needed to reduce the property's susceptibility to hurricane damage. And the purpose of these, the mitigation grants that were provided were to retrofit the single family homes to make them less vulnerable to hurricane damage. The My Safe Florida Home program was amended this year, I should say actually starting in December. One of the things that the legislature did back in 2006 was they put $250 million in non-recurring funds into a grant program that provided funding for those mitigation inspections and the mitigation grant repairs. However, in 2009, that funding was essentially exhausted and the legislature didn't re-up due to the recession that the legislature and the budget concerns that the legislature was dealing with. Most areas of education, the judiciary, healthcare, all of those areas were taking drastic budget cuts. And in 2009, the funds were exhausted and the legislature didn't provide any more funds to that program until December 2022 of this past year. In a special session, the legislature refunded that program, appropriating approximately $150 million in that special session. In the most recent regular session, the legislature added another $100 million to fund that program. What the legislature also did in House Bill 881 was it expanded the eligibility of where those homes who were eligible to participate in either a mitigation inspection or mitigation repairs. Prior to this legislation, House Bill 881, it was only in those areas that were designated as being at a particular risk for windstorm damage. With the changes in this most recent legislation, they have essentially broadened that to be any area of the state, but they've limited it to primarily those areas where, or I should say, only those homes that are single-family homes or certain townhomes that are homesteaded properties. So there, what you will see is the types of programs that they've created. We talked about House Bill 111. It was primarily focused on local governments and boosting the resiliency, the infrastructure resiliency. Here with House Bill 881, you're talking about a program that's focused more on the individual, those single family homes, those homes where people reside. Going on to the next piece of legislation, House Bill 799 is another example of how the legislature is seeking to address resiliency through regulatory efforts. Generally speaking, when an insurer is seeking to operate in Florida, they've got to provide a copy of their rates, the rate schedules, the rating manuals, the premium credits or discount schedules or surcharge schedules whenever they're seeking to operate in Florida and charge premiums for people who they're providing home insurance to. And OIR reviews those rate filings to determine whether the rates are excessive, inadequate, or unfairly discriminatory. Insurers are also required to provide credits, discounts, or other rate differentials or reductions in deductibles for properties with certain mitigation features. Mitigation features are construction techniques that are used to protect a structure against windstorm damage or loss, and they should be accounted for in residential property insurance rates. Some of these features include enhanced roof strength, roof covering performance, roof to wall strength, wall to floor to foundation strength, or appropriate protection for windows, doors, and skylights. Insurers presently have to account for mitigation measures that reduce hurricane losses, but they don't have to do it for all windstorm losses. House Bill 799 changes that, and it adopts a policy that incentivizes homeowners to adopt home hardening efforts. It requires a property insurer's residential rate filings must allow for the appropriate discounts for mitigation measures that reduce potential for windstorm losses. And it also adds wind uplift prevention to the list of features or construction techniques that have to be accounted for. Now, those were some of the key changes that were made this legislative session. Only, I believe it's House Bill 111 has been signed by the governor. The others will be presented to the governor. Based upon current readings, we don't see any reason why the governor is not likely to sign that legislation. Now, some of the things that the legislature is still kind of struggling with. as Ignacio mentioned, with some of our bills on resiliency, they didn't pass in the first year, they didn't pass in the second year, and they might not have even passed in the third year. Sometimes it's the fourth time that's the charm. Here are some bills that were considered this year, and we expect them to be back in the future. House Bill 810, or I'm sorry, 1151, and Senate Bill 810, and Senate Bill 950 and 669 were two of those pieces that were looking to expand the PACE program. For those not familiar with the PACE program, Florida doesn't actually have PACE, or the Property Excess Clean Energy Program, spelled out in its statutes, but there are programs that the legislature has created that essentially accomplishes that purpose. And the purpose of that is to fund property owners making qualifying improvements to repay the costs of certain improvements that make the property more energy efficient. Florida was considering, or the legislature was considering, legislation in the past couple of years that would expand those PACE programs to provide financing for resiliency improvements that would include creation or improvement of stormwater and flood resiliency. Both the Senate Bill 810, House Bill 1151, and Senate Bill 950 and House Bill 669 sought to expand those programs to provide those types of grant programs and those type of loan programs to homeowners looking to make those types of improvements. Also, House Bill or Senate Bill 1346, House Bill 1317 was dealing with unsafe structures, was looking to provide more incentives to bring down those structures or repair those structures that were unsafe. It was looking to narrow local governments, because sometimes local governments, due to a variety of reasons, might not always be making the safest choices for some of their local constituents. This legislation, which did make it across the finish line, but was looking to start replacing those unsafe structures in some of those coastal areas so that they could either be replaced with more resilient structures, or those structures could be revamped and remodeled to meet current buildings code standards. And that would conclude the highlights of what we've got. Thank you to everyone for listening and for your time this morning. And at this point, I'll turn it back over to Monty.
George, thank you very much. For everyone listening, and I think there was a question that I believe Blake answered. If any of you our attendees have questions, please let us know. Crystal, I haven't seen any more come through, but I was struck as I attended this webinar emphasizes what I'm about to say, but as I attended some of the previous ones, and the subject matters were water and energy and construction types, and there were various people from communities around Florida and architects and experts. And this webinar is about advocacy and policy, but I was struck as I attended some of the other five how much they also cross-pollinated with this. Advocacy helps drive the conversation, and policy on all of those levels begins to impact what we do and how we do it, either in limitations or opening opportunities for us to do more. So I salute you three that have spoken to us today. George, you said something. I'm going back to, in full transparency, I'm going back to one of our training sessions for this session, as you talked about young architects and watching their efforts and being involved. And that was, you essentially said, maybe you can say it better than I, but you essentially said, don't give up. And Ignacio has referenced that in his conversation as well. As a society, we often think you try it once, and if it doesn't work, well, I tried it. Instead, hang in there and keep the conversation going. And over time, you can have some impact in all of this. I don't know if you want to elaborate on that a little bit more, but as you've been discussing these things, and Ignacio, your timeline of things, it took years to make some of this stuff happen. And Blake, I know you see it at the national level. It takes years to make some of these things happen, and not getting upset and burning bridges, but maintaining relationships with our community leaders and our government leaders helps us to do that. I've just been impressed by that as we've had these webinars and continued these conversations.
And keep in mind that that
Go ahead.
relationship a lot of times starts locally. You know, try to get your local legislators, try to get get involved in your community little by little. That trickles up, and then when you go visit, like I said, you have a much broader impact if they recognize you walking in the room. They see you walking in the room. Oh, it's so and so. You know, you got to have those friendships, and I would recommend or submit that you should be careful about ideological issues. If you're there for AIA, you're there focused on the practice and the profession of architecture, and keep that open mind, because you don't have to talk to people that you may not agree with on other issues. This is the way of the world and how it operates in the legislative process. You've got to be open-minded and work with both sides of the aisle, both parties, both groups, to get things done. And it can be done. It's much more can be done than people think. You know, you hear all the screaming, yelling everywhere else, but at a local level, you can actually have a conversation with people as human beings and get issues moving forward. So it's critical that we all stay engaged. It's critical that you volunteer, whether it's your local components throughout the state, and volunteer to go to legislative day. I mean, I've been there, God, it's gotta be close to 15 years. I've been going there, maybe more, maybe 18 years going to legislative days. And I have not been on board that long, but so I did it as a volunteer from my component locally. So it's definitely something that everyone should do. Start local and move your way up into the state.
Yeah, and I think that if I remember my comments, the main thing to kind of remember is that anytime you're going in and advocating for a change, there's rarely going to be a confluence of factors that everybody is on board with the changes that you're making. So there are lots of different competing interests when these changes are being bantied about, and you're going to be talking to some people that might feel particular allegiances, or be more of a mindset of somebody who might be opposed to your changes. And it's helpful to kind of keep a couple of things in mind as you're having those conversations. One, keep in mind that they probably are not taking the position that they're taking because they want things that are bad for Florida. It might be more of a question of they feel like their ox is getting gored and they don't want their ox to get gored. So if they can have somebody else's ox get gored, they're okay with that, but just don't gore mine. Or the not my backyard type of principle. So don't always assume that they're negotiating from a position of bad faith, or that they don't want what's best for Florida. They just might feel that they're the ones making the sacrifice and you're not. Focus on those areas that you can kind of create a common ground for those discussions. And then last, just understand that it's all part of a longer, larger conversation about what's best for the state. And even what's best for the state is probably going to evolve. So as you're having those conversations, be open-minded, be flexible yourself to understand where the other interested parties are coming from. And the more flexible that you can be, the more likely you're going to be innovative in coming up with those solutions that are going to sort of maximize the benefit for everybody at the table.
Thank you. Blake, you mentioned something about building code in your presentation, and one of the I think conversations that you guys are having up there on the national level, and I'm curious about that, and I'll share this with you as well. On our resiliency committee, we're actually making an effort right now to propose some appendices to the Florida building code, so that they're not mandates that have to be done or anything like that initially, but they're appendices in the back of some of the codes. And this is going to be a daunting task, but there's a lot of people involved doing this, so that communities and local authorities can perhaps adopt them if they want. And we're kind of testing the water and putting our toes in the water about that to go above and beyond what the typical building code would require regarding resiliency. So I'm saying that to say this: A, if anybody watching this wants to participate in that effort, please join us, because it's a daunting task. But B, it also allows us to impact and affect policy, not just through the legislative process, but through, building officials and conversations with them, and other organizations that affect some of the things that guide us on how we do how we do what we do to make things better and safer and more resilient. So I'm curious what the effort is nationally, because are y'all talking about the Florida Building Code when you're having those conversations?
Florida comes up all the time, to be honest with you, Monty. That is one of those states that is near and dear in a lot of folks' heads at the federal level. Certainly very relevant state, obviously, to the building code, to the resilience sort of debate. Not sort of specifically talking about Florida, but sort of broadly speaking across the country, where we really see where we're most impactful at the federal level is providing those resources that the states and localities can then leverage to do a lot of the work, Monty, that you just highlighted. We recognize there's 50 different states. There's a lot of variance there on the level of code adoption state by state. That's a state regulated policy. Some municipalities go a little bit farther, Monty, as you were mentioning. But at the federal level, and something that we called for significant funding through sort of the infrastructure debate, the IRA, and with other legislation like the Resilient America Act I mentioned earlier, is to ramp up those resources and incentives, not necessarily to force municipalities and states to get those codes up to speed, but to incentivize them and give them the tools to do that. So tools and financial resources to reach code adoption and later code adoption, or even most recent or stretch code adoption, and also building enforcement. I mean, I think this audience recognizes well that a building code is only as strong as it is the enforcement mechanism, really. So providing sort of those funding streams so that could be an eligible use at the federal or at the state and local level is something that we often think through when we're talking about building codes, kind of giving the tools to y'all to make that happen.
Excellent. Well, Crystal is waving the checkered flag, saying we need to bring this thing in and push the stop button on it. I want to thank everyone, Blake and Ignacio and George in particular, for your participation in this, and the Resilience Committee. You saw the slide there earlier about all the participants on that. Peter, thank you for coming. Elizabeth, I think you're still here as well. The leadership, people have said, if you want to get something done, surround yourself with smart people. I love that long list of people in that committee, because they bring things to this discussion that just astound me at times. And I would invite anyone else who wants to participate in this process to do so. Crystal, I'm gonna turn it over to you. Elizabeth, Peter, if y'all have anything that you would like to add or conclude with, that'd be great. But I thank you very much for joining us, and I hope this isn't the last time we do this, because this technology and this need is changing all the time. So let's agree to do this again sometime in the future.
Oh, thank you, Monty, Peter, and all the panelists for the wonderful session, very educational, informative, and thought-provoking. I just want to thank again and encourage you all to stay tuned, and hopefully we'll come back with another webinar series next year. So hopefully we can continue this conversation and try to push the need a little bit forward. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Bye-bye.